My name is Evelyn Blackwood, and I am 31 years old. If you had walked into my apartment in downtown Richmond on a Tuesday evening, you would find me scrubbed raw, smelling of industrial-grade disinfectant and stale hospital coffee, decompressing from a 12-hour shift as a senior trauma nurse where I earn a meticulously tracked $92,400 a year. Every cent of my life is accounted for by my own sweat. Every mortgage payment on my modest condo is signed by my own hand, and every accomplishment I have ever achieved has been met with a chilling silence from the people who share my DNA. But 5 years ago, I wasn't the woman I am now. 5 years ago, I was still trying to fit into a mold that was designed to break me. Let's see if you're even a part of this bloodline, or just a 26-year-old mistake I've been financing. My father sneered, his voice cutting through the heavy, spice-laden air of the dining room. The sound of his voice was like a serrated blade against silk, cold and intentionally jagged. With a flick of his wrist, he slid a blue and white box, a $189 Ancestry DNA health kit, across the polished mahogany surface of a table that cost more than my first car. It skidded past the 14-pound organic heritage turkey and came to a rest right against the edge of my gold-rimmed spode china plate. 28 relatives froze in unison. It was a choreographed paralysis that only the wealthy can truly master. Their silver forks, heavy with the weight of generations of entitlement, hovered mid-air. The only sound in the room was the rhythmic, soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer and the distant crackle of the fire in the hearth. My brother, Brandon, the golden child who had never seen a bill he couldn't pass off to an assistant, smirked. He adjusted the lapels of his $450 Theory blazer, his eyes gleaming with the predatory delight of a man watching a car crash from the safety of a sidewalk. My mother, Diane, refused to meet my gaze. She sat at the opposite end of the table, her manicured fingers trembling slightly as she swirled an $85 bottle of Caymus Cabernet in a Riedel crystal glass, watching the dark red liquid coat the sides as if it held the secrets to 30 years of her own carefully constructed lies. I remember the exact temperature of the room, 72 degrees, controlled by a Nest thermostat that I wasn't allowed to touch. I remember the scent of rosemary and expensive perfume. My father, Julian Blackwood, was a man who measured worth in equity and loyalty in percentages. To him, I had always been the bad investment. I was the daughter who chose public service over the family's $4.2 million real estate empire. I was the one who worked night shifts at the county hospital instead of hosting charity galas at the country club. And that night, under the glow of a $3,000 chandelier, he decided to turn his suspicions into a public execution. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Now let me take you back to that Thanksgiving evening in the Blackwood estate, a sprawling colonial on a hill that overlooked everything but saw nothing at all. The tension had been simmering since I pulled my 5-year-old Honda Civic into the driveway, parked between Brandon's brand-new BMW M5 and my uncle's Range Rover. I was already the outsider. I was wearing a dress I'd bought on sale at Nordstrom Rack for $60, feeling the weight of their judgment before I even stepped through the door. The insult hadn't come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of years of being told I didn't belong, that I didn't have the Blackwood nose or the Blackwood temper. My father had spent the last hour detailing Brandon's latest promotion, a vice presidency handed to him on a silver platter, while barely acknowledging my mention of a successful resuscitation I'd performed on a car crash victim 2 nights prior. To them, my work was messy. It was unrefined. And apparently, it was suspicious. I looked down at the DNA kit. The plastic wrap caught the light, shimmering like a taunt. My father's hand was still resting on the table, his heavy gold signet ring catching the overhead light. He was 62 years old, a man whose skin looked like expensive parchment and whose heart had long since been replaced by a ledger. He wanted a performance. He wanted me to cry, to beg, to defend my mother's honor or my own right to the family name. The relatives were leaning in now, the initial shock giving way to a morbid curiosity. This was better than any entertainment he could have hired. I didn't cry. In the trauma ward, you learn very quickly that tears don't stop bleeding and screaming doesn't clear an airway. You learn to be cold. You learn to be precise. I reached out, my fingers steady, and I picked up the box. It felt light, almost weightless, despite the heavy implications it carried. I looked my father directly in his pale gray eyes, the eyes he claimed were the hallmark of his lineage, and I felt a strange, terrifying sense of calm wash over me. "Is this what you want, Dad?" I asked. My voice was level, devoid of the tremor he was fishing for. "You want to spend nearly $200 to satisfy a whim because I didn't vote the way you wanted or because I work on my feet instead of in a leather chair?" Julian leaned back, his chest swelling with the arrogance of a man who had never been told no. "I want to know where that rebellious streak comes from, Evelyn. Brandon is a Blackwood through and through. You're a stranger in my house. You've always been. Let's just see if the science matches the behavior. Consider it a late birthday present. I know how much you love facts and figures." I looked at my mother then. Her face was a mask of pale foundation and Botox, but her eyes were darting toward the hallway, toward anything but the table. She knew. In that moment, seeing the way her throat tightened as she took a desperate gulp of her wine, I realized that this wasn't just a father's cruelty. This was a catalyst. The silence from her was a confession in itself. She had spent 3 decades playing the role of the perfect socialite wife to a man who ruled with a velvet glove over an iron fist, and the cracks were finally starting to show. "Fine," I said. The word was a short, sharp snap in the quiet room. I took the kit and tucked it into my purse, which sat on the floor by my chair. "I'll do it. But understand this, Julian. Once those results come back, there is no undoing what you've started. You're asking for the truth. Just make sure you can afford the price when it arrives." Brandon let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Oh, please, Evie, stop with the drama. It's just a spit test. Unless you're worried about what it'll say. Maybe you're actually the milkman's kid. It would explain the lack of fashion sense." The table erupted into muffled chuckles. My aunts whispered behind their hands, and my cousins exchanged glances that said they couldn't wait to talk about this in the car on the way home. I sat through the rest of the dinner in a trance. I watched the way my father carved the turkey with the precision of a man who enjoyed the act of cutting through bone. I watched the way the candlelight flickered against the heavy velvet curtains that cost $12,000 per window. I realized that for 26 years, I had been trying to earn the love of a man who viewed me as a line item on a balance sheet. I left that night without saying goodbye to anyone but the housekeeper, Maria, who was the only person in that house who had ever asked if I'd eaten enough. As I drove my Honda back toward the city, the DNA kit sitting on the passenger seat, I felt a weight lifting. The Blackwood empire, with its $4.2 million in assets, its country club memberships, and its suffocating expectations, felt smaller in my rearview mirror. I was Evelyn Blackwood, a woman who knew the exact cost of a life-saving unit of blood and the precise rhythm of a failing heart. My father thought he was testing my loyalty, but he was actually handing me the keys to my own prison. 3 weeks later, the notification appeared on my phone while I was in the hospital break room. The email subject line was simple: "Your ancestry DNA results are ready." My heart gave a singular, heavy thud against my ribs, the kind of palpitations I usually treated in others. I sat there, surrounded by the smell of burnt coffee and the hum of the vending machine, and I clicked the link. I scrolled past the ethnicity estimates, past the maps of northwestern Europe, and went straight to the DNA matches. The screen didn't show what Julian Blackwood expected. It didn't show a lack of connection to the man who had humiliated me at the Thanksgiving table. In fact, it showed something far more devastating for the Blackwood legacy. It showed that I was indeed Julian's daughter, his only biological child. But as I scrolled further down the list of close relatives, searching for my brother, I found something else. Or rather, I found a glaring absence. Brandon wasn't there, not as a full sibling, not as a half-sibling. Instead, there was a match for a second cousin I'd never met on my mother's side, and a string of names that had nothing to do with the Blackwood name. I felt a cold shiver of realization. My father had spent 30 years grooming a golden boy who wasn't his, while systematically tearing down the only person who actually shared his blood. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. He had paid $189 to prove I was a mistake, and instead, he had bought the demolition charge for his own life. I didn't call him. I didn't cry. I simply hit print on the hospital's networked printer. I watched the pages slide out, warm to the touch, containing the digital proof of 30 years of deception. I tucked them into my nursing bag, zipped it shut, and went back to the floor. I had a patient in room 402 with a fractured femur and a rising heart rate. I had work to do, but as I walked down the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway, I knew that the next time I sat at that mahogany table, the conversation wouldn't be about my mistakes. It would be about the total collapse of the Blackwood name. Family isn't just about whose blood runs through your veins. It's about who stands by you when the world goes dark. And my father was about to find out that he had spent his entire life investing in a lie while trying to bankrupt the truth. The contrast in the Blackwood household was not merely a matter of differing lifestyle choices. It was surgical, a deliberate and calculated dissection of worth that left me on the cold side of the operating table for over 3 decades. My father, Harrison Blackwood, was a man who viewed the world through the lens of structural integrity and profit margins, running a civil engineering firm that boasted a net annual profit of $1.8 million. He moved through life with the heavy, unyielding grace of the skyscrapers he helped design, usually ensconced in the driver's seat of his black 2024 BMW X7. That vehicle was more than a mode of transport. It was a rolling sanctuary of status, featuring custom cognac leather that smelled of wealth and success, a scent that never quite seemed to cling to me no matter how hard I worked. Then there was Brandon, the undisputed golden child of the Blackwood dynasty. At 28 years old, Brandon had nominally worked at the firm for 3 years, though his professional contributions were largely a myth constructed to justify his presence on the payroll. In reality, his primary occupation consisted of charging $1,200 bottle service tabs at the city's most exclusive lounges to the corporate American Express card, a recurring expense that my father dismissed as networking while he scrutinized my every request for a basic necessity during my childhood. While the men of the family navigated a world of high-stakes contracts and mahogany row offices, my reality was measured in 60-hour weeks and the relentless hum of the trauma ward. I lived in a 640-square-foot apartment in a neighborhood where the streetlights flickered with a tired, rhythmic uncertainty. Every morning, without fail, the radiator in my bedroom would begin its jagged, metallic hiss at exactly 4:15 a.m., a sound that served as my primary alarm clock and a constant reminder of the physical distance between my life and the sprawling Blackwood estate. The walls were thin enough that I could hear the neighbor's television, a stark contrast to the soundproofed sanctuary of my father's study, where he calculated the stresses of steel and concrete. On my wrist, I didn't wear the Rolex submariners that my father and Brandon flashed like badges of merit. Instead, I wore a $25 Casio digital watch. It was a utilitarian choice, selected specifically because the resin strap was easy to bleach and disinfect after a grueling shift in the ER, where blood, bile, and sweat were the everyday markers of my profession. To my father, that watch was a symbol of my failure to embrace the family's aesthetic. To me, it was the only thing in that house that told the truth about the value of time. The financial chasm between us was perhaps the most painful part of the surgical divide. I had clawed my way through nursing school, eventually facing a mountain of $62,000 in student loans. While Brandon was off on spring breaks in Cabo San Lucas, I was calculating interest rates and living on ramen noodles and shift meals. I paid off every single cent of that debt in 48 grueling monthly installments, often picking up double shifts on holidays just to shave a few $100s off the principal. I remember the day I made the final payment. I sat in my small kitchen, staring at the digital confirmation on my laptop, feeling a sense of pride that was entirely solitary. My father never asked about my loans, nor did he offer a single dollar toward my education, claiming that he wanted me to learn the value of a hard-earned dollar. Yet that philosophy of rugged individualism apparently didn't apply to the golden child. In the same year I cleared my debt, Harrison didn't blink when he cut a check for $85,000 to cover the repairs on Brandon's Porsche 911 after he'd wrapped it around a light pole during a drunken midnight joyride. The hypocrisy was a silent, suffocating weight in the room every time we gathered for a mandatory family meal. Being a senior trauma nurse meant that I dealt in the rawest form of human currency, witnessing the moments where life either held fast or slipped away. Yet in the Blackwood dining room, my expertise was treated as a low-level service job. My father would talk about the tensile strength of bridge cables while ignoring the fact that I had spent my night stabilizing a teenager with a crushed pelvis. He admired the engineering of a dam, but mocked the precision required to navigate a central line into a collapsing vein. Brandon would sit there, adjusting the cuffs of a shirt that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, regaling the table with stories of his golf handicap or the vintage of the wine he'd discovered at a boutique vineyard in Napa. I would look at his soft hands that had never known the grit of real labor, and then look at mine, which were often cracked from constant washing and stained with the faint, lingering scent of antiseptic. The injustice wasn't just in the money, it was in the fundamental refusal to see me as a person of substance. I was the ghost at the feast, a biological necessity that had failed to meet the corporate branding requirements of the Blackwood name. The 2024 BMW X7 sat in the driveway of the estate like a dark monument to my father's ego, its metallic paint shimmering under the recessed lighting of the four-car garage. Inside the house, the air was always perfectly filtered, the temperature kept at a steady 69 degrees, a luxury I couldn't afford in my drafty apartment where I often wore 3 layers of clothing just to keep the winter chill at bay. Harrison's office was a shrine to his achievements, filled with framed photographs of him shaking hands with governors and mayors, while the only photo of me in the entire house was a grainy 5x7 from my high school graduation, tucked away on a lower shelf in a hallway no one used. He prided himself on his logic and his ability to see the flaws in any design, yet he was completely blind to the rot that was spreading through his own family. He saw Brandon's reckless spending as youthful exuberance and my disciplined frugality as a lack of ambition. He saw my career not as a calling, but as a stubborn refusal to join the family business, a betrayal of the bloodline he held so dear. The radiator's hiss at 4:15 a.m. became a kind of mantra for me, a daily signal that I was still standing, still fighting, and still independent. While Brandon woke up at noon in a bedroom with silk sheets, nursing a hangover and waiting for the maid to bring him coffee, I was already on my second cup of black coffee in a crowded break room, preparing for a handoff. I knew the exact cost of every item in my life because I had traded hours of my life for them. The $25 Casio was a badge of honor, a testament to the fact that I didn't need a $4,000 timepiece to know that every second counted. Harrison and Brandon moved through a world of cushioned blows and safety nets where an $85,000 mistake was just a minor inconvenience covered by a wire transfer. I lived in a world where a single mistake could mean the end of a life, where there were no corporate Amex cards to fix a ruptured aorta or a stopped heart. This was the atmosphere that led up to that fateful Thanksgiving, the simmering resentment of a daughter who had been outpaced by a ghost and a brother who was being rewarded for his incompetence. The $4.2 million empire that my father had built was a fortress of glass and steel, impressive to look at from the outside, but fragile at its core. He thought he was the architect of a legacy, but he was really just the foreman of a crumbling foundation. Every time he looked at me with that subtle, condescending smirk, as if he were wondering how he had sired such a common creature, I felt the steel in my spine grow stronger. I didn't need his cognac leather or his custom-built SUVs. I had my own strength, forged in the high-pressure environment of the ER and tempered by the cold reality of my apartment. I was Evelyn Blackwood, and while they were busy playing at being royalty, I was busy becoming the only person in the family who actually knew how to survive a storm. The financial records of the firm were something my father guarded with a religious fervor, yet he would leave Brandon's credit card statements lying on the mahogany table as if they were trophies of a life well lived. I once saw a bill for a single dinner in Manhattan that totaled more than my annual car insurance. It wasn't just the extravagance that burned, it was the casualness of it, the way they treated wealth as an infinite resource while I was counting out quarters for the laundromat. Harrison's BMW represented everything he valued: power, prestige, and the ability to distance himself from the messy reality of the world. My Casio represented everything he despised: practicality, transparency, and a connection to the pulse of the everyday man. He never understood that the very things he looked down upon were the things that made me unbreakable. He had built his world out of expensive materials that could be bought and sold, but I had built mine out of experiences that could never be taken away. When the DNA kit finally slid across that table, it wasn't just a test of my paternity. It was a collision between two worlds that had been drifting apart for years, a final surgical strike that would determine which of us was actually built to last. He thought he was putting me under the microscope, but he had no idea that I was already looking through the lens, seeing the fractures in his empire that he was too proud to acknowledge. The Blackwood name was about to undergo a structural failure that no amount of engineering could fix, and for the first time in my life, I was the one holding the blueprints to the truth. The betrayal did not come as a sudden explosion, but rather as a cold, calculated restructuring of my very existence, occurring on November 23rd at exactly 7:42 p.m. The digital clock on the oven flickered with those precise red numbers as I stood in the kitchen of the Blackwood estate, the air heavy with the scent of expensive roasting herbs and the oppressive weight of a looming storm. My father, Harrison Blackwood, was seated at the head of the mahogany table, his large, weathered hand wrapped around a heavy crystal tumbler containing 2 fingers of Macallan 18, a scotch that costs over $500 a bottle and carries the smoky, peat-filled aroma of old money and unyielding authority. He didn't look at me as he spoke. Instead, he watched the golden liquid swirl against the ice, his eyes fixed on the amber whirlpool as if he were reading the future of his empire in the condensation. The announcement was delivered with the same clinical detachment he used when discussing a structural flaw in a bridge or a missed deadline on a construction site in Greenwich. He informed us, with a voice that lacked even a tremor of paternal warmth, that the Blackwood Family Trust was being officially and legally restructured. This trust was not merely a bank account, it was the bedrock of the family's perceived superiority, holding the deeds to 3 sprawling properties in Greenwich, Connecticut, where the median home price hovered around $3 million and the lawns were manicured with the precision of a surgeon's incision. Harrison's voice turned even colder, reaching a sub-zero temperature that seemed to frost the very windows of the dining room as he laid out his vision for the future. "Brandon is the legacy," he said, the words falling like heavy stones into a deep, dark well. He finally looked up then, his gray eyes pinning me to the spot with a gaze that was devoid of any recognition of our shared history. "Evelyn, you've always been different," he continued, emphasizing the word as if it were a polite euphemism for a defect in the manufacturing process. "I am not signing over 35% of a multi-million-dollar portfolio to someone who might not even be a Blackwood, someone whose loyalty is to a hospital ward instead of the name that provided everything she has ever touched." The silence that followed was so thick I could hear the faint, frantic scratching of my mother's fingernails against the underside of the table, before she finally dropped her embroidered linen napkin. It fluttered to the Persian rug like a wounded bird, a stark white blot against the intricate red and navy patterns of the silk fibers. My mother, Diane, looked as though she had been struck, her face a pale mask of horror and desperation. Yet she remained silent, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. She knew the mechanics of this house better than anyone. She knew that when Harrison made a decree, the air in the room became his to ration. Beside her, Brandon didn't even pretend to share her shock. Instead, he let out a laugh, a sharp, jagged, and ugly sound that grated against the fine china and the quiet dignity of the room. He leaned back in his chair, the fine fabric of his blazer bunching at his shoulders, and looked at me with a predatory smirk that told me he had been waiting for this moment since we were children. "Just spit in the tube, sis," he mocked, his voice dripping with a casual cruelty that only someone who has never faced a consequence can truly afford. "Unless you're afraid the mailman's DNA will show up and we find out you're just a clerical error in the family tree." I stood there, my hands instinctively clenching into fists at my sides, the familiar sting of professional composure battling the raw, searing heat of personal humiliation. As a senior trauma nurse, I have stood in rooms where bodies were torn apart by physics and chance, where the smell of copper and ozone filled the air, and I have never flinched. But in that dining room, under the glow of a chandelier that cost more than my entire nursing education, I felt a different kind of trauma. This was a deliberate attempt to exhume my identity and put it on trial for the crime of not being enough like them. Harrison took a slow, deliberate sip of his Macallan, the ice clinking against the glass with a sound that felt like a gavel striking a bench. He had already decided I was an outsider. The DNA test was merely the formal paperwork for my eviction from the family narrative. He was prepared to strip away my inheritance, a 35% stake in a portfolio valued at millions, based on a suspicion he had nursed like a bitter vintage for years. The properties in Greenwich were more than just assets to him. They were monuments to the Blackwood ego and the thought of me, the daughter who came home smelling of disinfectant and spoke of patience instead of profits. Owning a piece of them was an affront to his sensibilities. Brandon, on the other hand, saw it as a victory. He saw my potential 35% as his own gain, another few million to fuel his bottle service tabs and his reckless midnight drives. He didn't care about the truth of our bloodline. He only cared about the consolidation of power. He watched me with those mocking eyes, waiting for me to break, waiting for the tears that he thought would prove my weakness. But he forgot who I was. He forgot that I spend my days and nights in the presence of real suffering, that I have held the hands of people as they crossed the threshold into the unknown, and that I have a threshold for pain that he couldn't possibly imagine. I looked at the blue and white box of the Ancestry DNA kit sitting on the table, a $189 instrument of destruction that my father had wielded like a weapon. It was surreal to think that a small plastic tube and a few milliliters of saliva were being positioned as the ultimate arbiters of my worth. The technicality of the kit was simple, but the emotional architecture of the moment was incredibly complex. My mother's eyes were fixed on the kit now, and for a fleeting second, I saw a flash of genuine terror in her gaze, not for me, but for herself. She was the one who had lived in this house for 30 years, maintaining the facade, ensuring the cognac leather was conditioned and the Macallan was stocked. She was the one who had built her life on the foundation of Harrison's approval, and now that foundation was being shaken by the very man who built it. The clock ticked over to 7:45 p.m. 3 minutes had passed since my world was restructured, yet it felt like an eternity. I realized then that my father's coldness wasn't just a personality trait. It was a policy. He didn't want a daughter. He wanted a reflection. He didn't want a family. He wanted a succession plan that validated his own ego. By questioning my biological connection to him, he was attempting to erase the 31 years I had spent trying to earn his respect. He was saying that my hard work, my 60-hour weeks, my student loan payments, and my dedication to a grueling profession meant nothing if they weren't backed by the specific sequence of nucleotides he deemed valuable. It was the ultimate betrayal of the spirit, a rejection that went deeper than money or property. I felt the weight of my $25 Casio watch on my wrist, the resin strap a humble contrast to the gold and steel that surrounded me. It told me exactly how much time I was wasting in this room with people who viewed me as a liability. I looked at Brandon, whose theory blazer seemed to shrink as I truly saw him, not as the golden child, but as a hollow vessel filled with our father's worst impulses. And I looked at Harrison, the architect of this misery, who was now swirling the last of his scotch, waiting for my answer. He thought he was the one in control, but he had no idea that I had already spent years building a life that didn't require his signature or his trust fund. The Macallan 18 left a lingering, woody scent in the air, a smell I knew I would associate with this betrayal for the rest of my life. Every detail of the room was etched into my mind with agonizing clarity. The way the light caught the edge of the gold-rimmed spode china, the slight tremor in my mother's hands as she reached for her wineglass, and the smug, expectant tilt of Brandon's head. They were a tableau of a dying empire, and I was the only one who could see the cracks in the walls. Harrison believed that by threatening my inheritance, he was holding me hostage, but in reality, he was setting me free. He was giving me the one thing I had never truly had in that house, the truth of where I stood. I finally spoke, and my voice was as steady as a surgeon's hand during a delicate extraction. "I'll take your test, Harrison," I said, using his first name for the first time in my life, feeling the sharp intake of breath from my mother as the word hit the air. "But understand that once the results are in, the restructuring won't just be about the trust. It will be about everything. You want to know if I'm a Blackwood? You're about to find out that being a Blackwood is the least interesting thing about me." I reached out and pulled the kit toward me, the cardboard sliding across the mahogany with a soft, final sound. Brandon's smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face as he realized I wasn't afraid. I wasn't the victim they wanted me to be. I was a woman who dealt in life and death every single day, and I wasn't about to let a $189 kit or a bitter man with a glass of scotch decide who I was. The Blackwood family trust was indeed being restructured, but not in the way my father intended. The foundation was already crumbling, and I was the only one who wasn't going to be crushed when it finally fell. The silence of the night was absolute as I sat inside my 2018 Honda Civic, the interior smelling faintly of the lavender car freshener I used to mask the lingering scent of hospital-grade sanitizers and the remnants of a long-forgotten takeout coffee. Outside the windshield, the Blackwood estate loomed like a Gothic fortress of ivory and stone, its security lights casting long, predatory shadows across the meticulously manicured lawn that cost $4,000 a month just to maintain in its state of unnatural perfection. I reached out and tapped the digital display on the dashboard, watching the glowing green numbers flicker as they transitioned to exactly 11:34 p.m., marking the final minutes of a day that had effectively severed my tether to the only life I had ever known. My hands, usually so steady when navigating the delicate tissues of a thoracic cavity or securing a difficult intubation, were remarkably still as I reached into my nursing bag and pulled out a yellow legal pad and a black ink pen. I clicked the pen, the sound echoing in the cramped utilitarian space of the car, and I drew a single vertical line down the center of the first page with the same anatomical precision I would use to mark a surgical site. On the left-hand side, in my neat clinical script, I wrote the words, "Loyalty shown, 31 years," and beneath it, I began to list the invisible costs of my devotion, from the missed holidays spent at my father's beck and call to the countless times I had swallowed my own pride to maintain the fragile peace of the Blackwood dinner table. On the right-hand side, I penned a single devastating metric: respect received, 0%. The starkness of the contrast on the page was more than just a financial audit. It was a psychological autopsy of a relationship that had been dead for a very long time. I realized in that quiet midnight hour that my family treated love not as a bond of blood or affection, but as a complex, high-interest transaction where I was always the debtor and they were the predatory lenders. Every meal provided, every tuition payment ignored, and every cold glance was a ledger entry designed to keep me in a state of perpetual gratitude for a life I was barely allowed to inhabit. They didn't want a daughter. They wanted a subordinate who would validate their superiority by simply existing in their shadow. I decided right then, with the dashboard clock ticking toward midnight, to apply the same clinical precision I use in the trauma bay to the execution of my exit from the Blackwood empire. In the ER, when a patient arrives with a catastrophic hemorrhage, you don't waste time on sentiment or why. You focus on the how, you identify the source of the bleed, and you clamp it with unwavering resolve. I was going to treat my family dynamic like a trauma case. I wouldn't just take the ancestry DNA test to satisfy Harrison's cruel curiosity. I would use it as the first piece of evidence in a comprehensive audit of the entire Blackwood lie. If my father wanted to play with the fire of genetic certainty, I was more than happy to let the entire house burn down to the foundation. I reached for the blue and white kit sitting on the passenger seat, the cardboard feeling cold and clinical against my skin, and I began the process with a sense of detached professional focus. I opened the sterile packaging, carefully avoiding any contamination of the collection tube, and I thought about the irony of the situation. Harrison had spent 30 years building a brand of excellence, a $4.2 million portfolio built on the idea that the Blackwood name was synonymous with structural integrity, yet he was the one who had introduced the most volatile element of doubt into his own home. I followed the instructions with a nurse's attention to detail, knowing that the validity of the results was paramount. I swished the stabilizing liquid in the vial for exactly 60 seconds, my eyes fixed on the seconds hand of my $25 Casio watch, counting each beat of time as if it were a pulse. 1, 2, 3, 4. With every second that passed, I felt the heavy, suffocating weight of my childhood expectations falling away, replaced by a cold, refreshing clarity that was as sharp as a scalpel. By the time the 60 seconds were up, I wasn't just sealing a plastic bag, I was sealing the fate of the people inside that house. The process was rhythmic and meditative. I capped the vial, hearing the small, satisfying click that confirmed the seal was airtight. I placed it into the biohazard bag, the plastic crinkling in the silence of the car, and then into the prepaid mailing envelope. This small package, weighing no more than a few ounces, carried the potential to bankrupt a legacy that had been decades in the making. I thought about Brandon, likely already asleep in his $400 Egyptian cotton sheets, dreaming of his next promotion or his next luxury watch, completely unaware that the sister he mocked was currently holding the detonator to his entire world. I thought about my mother, Diane, and the way her hand had trembled at the table, wondering what secrets she had buried beneath the layers of expensive foundation and social grace. I realized that the different nature my father had always complained about, my independence, my resilience, my refusal to be bought, was the very thing that made me the most dangerous person in his life. I was the only one who didn't fear the truth, because I was the only one who hadn't built my life on a foundation of his money. As I sat there, the engine of the Civic long since cooled, I looked at the legal pad one last time. The ink was dry, the audit was complete, and the conclusion was inescapable. There was no path forward that involved me remaining a silent participant in their charade. Harrison's attempt to use a $189 kit to humiliate me had backfired before the test had even left the driveway. He had handed me the tool of my own liberation and called it a threat. I put the car in reverse, the headlights cutting through the darkness and illuminating the heavy oak doors of the estate, and I backed out of the long, winding driveway for what I knew would be the last time as the daughter they thought they could control. The transition from the gravel of the driveway to the smooth asphalt of the public road felt like crossing a border. The drive back to my 640-square-foot apartment was peaceful, the city lights blurred by a light mist that had begun to fall. I felt a strange sense of empathy for the man my father was, a man so insecure in his own power that he had to attack his own child to feel substantial. But that empathy didn't soften my resolve. In the trauma bay, we often have to cause a little bit of pain to fix a much larger problem. We have to reset the bone. We have to debride the wound. We have to be honest about the damage before the healing can begin. This was my debridement. The Blackwood family was a necrotic limb, and I was finally ready to perform the amputation. I would mail the kit at the 24-hour post office on my way to my next shift, and then I would wait. I would wait with the same patience I use when monitoring a patient's vitals after a major surgery, watching for the subtle shifts that indicate the body is finally starting to fight back. When I reached my apartment, the radiator was already starting its nightly hiss, the sound no longer an annoyance but a familiar, honest greeting. I walked into my small kitchen, placed the envelope on the counter, and made myself a cup of tea. The yellow legal pad sat on the table, its list of grievances a testament to 3 decades of endurance. I realized that for my entire life, I had been trying to fill a void in my father's heart with my own achievements, only to find that the void was a bottomless pit of his own making. The $92,400 I earned every year was more than enough to sustain me, and the 60 hours a week I spent in the service of others gave me a purpose that no family trust could ever match. I was whole, I was capable, and I was finally, irrevocably done. The clarity I felt was not the heat of anger, but the stillness of ice. I knew exactly what steps to take next. I would continue my shifts, I would save my money, and I would prepare for the day the results arrived in my inbox. I would not engage in their petty arguments, and I would not respond to their snide comments. I would be a ghost until the moment the truth required me to be a judge. Harrison Blackwood thought he was restructuring a portfolio, but he had actually initiated a total structural collapse. As I lay down in my bed, the thin walls of my apartment offering more comfort than the soundproofed rooms of the estate ever had, I felt a deep, marrow-deep sense of peace. The audit was over, the debt was canceled, and for the first time in 31 years, Evelyn Blackwood was no longer for sale. The Blackwood lie was about to be exposed, and I was the one who had finally stopped paying the interest on their deception. The clock hit 12:01 a.m., the start of a new day and the beginning of the end for the empire on the hill. I closed my eyes, the rhythmic hiss of the radiator lulling me into a sleep that was deeper and more restful than any I had known since I was a child. Tomorrow, the kit would be in the mail, and the clock would start ticking for them, just as it had always ticked for me. I did not spend those 3 weeks of waiting in a state of idle anxiety or weeping over the shattered remnants of my childhood illusions. Instead, I took the $2,500 I had painstakingly saved from a year of picking up overtime holiday shifts and invested it into the clinical dismantling of the Blackwood legacy. I sought out the services of a private forensic accountant and a high-end estate attorney named Marcus Sterling, a man whose reputation for scorched-earth litigation was as formidable as the 42nd-floor office he occupied in the heart of the financial district. Stepping into his sanctuary was like entering a different realm of power, one that smelled intensely of expensive Davidoff cigars and aged leather bindings, a scent that stood in sharp contrast to the antiseptic sting of the trauma ward where I spent my nights. Sterling sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of dark walnut, silhouetted against a floor-to-ceiling window that offered a dizzying view of the city's skyline, and he watched me with the calculating gaze of a man who saw the world as a series of chess moves and contractual loopholes. He didn't offer me platitudes or hollow comfort. He simply reached out and began tapping a $150 Mont Blanc Meisterstuck pen against a leather-bound blotter, the rhythmic clicking sound echoing the beating of my own determined heart. "If the DNA results are what I suspect based on the timeline you have provided," Sterling said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that carried the weight of 30 years of legal warfare, "then we are not merely looking at a family squabble over a dinner table insult. We are looking at a massive, systemic case of fraud regarding your late grandmother's original 1994 will, a document that seems to have been conveniently reinterpreted the moment she was no longer here to defend her intentions." He leaned forward, the light from the window catching the silver at his temples and the sharp crease of his bespoke pinstripe suit, and I realized that I had finally found someone who spoke the same language of facts and evidence that I relied on in the emergency room. For 21 days, I operated on a maximum of 4 hours of sleep, transitioning seamlessly from the high-stakes environment of the hospital to the dusty, silent archives of the county records office and the fluorescent-lit basements of legacy banks. I gathered exactly 142 pages of meticulous bank statements, some of which required court orders to unearth, and tracked down 12 archived property deeds that had been shuffled through a shell game of holding companies and trusts. I spent hours hunched over my small kitchen table, the radiator hissing its 4:15 a.m. greeting as I cross-referenced dates, signatures, and wire transfer amounts with the focus of a surgeon performing a delicate neurosurgical bypass. The paper trail I uncovered was a map of betrayal that went back decades, revealing that the Blackwood empire, the $4.2 million portfolio my father flaunted like a badge of divine right, was not built on the foundation of his supposed brilliance or his tireless hard work. It was a hollow structure built on the bones of a stolen inheritance, specifically, a massive portion of my grandmother's estate that had been legally earmarked for me, her only granddaughter, but was diverted through a series of forged signatures and clerical errors orchestrated by Harrison the moment the soil was fresh on her grave. My grandmother, Eleanor Blackwood, had been a woman of immense foresight and quiet steel, and as I turned the pages of the 1994 will, her voice seemed to rise from the faded ink, demanding the justice that her son had tried to bury under layers of cognac leather and BMW lease agreements. The technicality of the theft was breathtaking in its arrogance. Harrison had assumed that I, the different child who was more interested in stethoscopes than spreadsheets, would never have the financial literacy or the sheer audacity to audit his kingdom. He had underestimated the discipline of a woman who had to account for every milligram of morphine and every second of a cardiac arrest. By the end of the second week, my legal pad was no longer a list of grievances but a comprehensive indictment, filled with specific account numbers, dates of fraudulent transfers, and the names of the long-retired paralegals who had witnessed the original documents. Every document I scanned into Sterling's secure portal felt like a brick being pulled from the wall of the Blackwood estate, making the entire structure lean just a few inches further toward a total collapse. I paid Sterling's initial retainer with a cashier's check that represented my entire emergency fund, a move that would have terrified me months ago, but now felt as necessary as a life-saving blood transfusion. Sterling looked over the final dossier I brought him, his Mont Blanc pen finally still as he absorbed the sheer volume of evidence I had compiled. "This is surgical, Evelyn," he remarked, looking up at me with a newfound respect that I had never once received from the man who shared my last name. "Most people in your position would have just let the DNA test be the end of it, but you've managed to find the primary tumor. If the lab confirms that Brandon is not Harrison's biological son, his legal standing to inherit any portion of the 1994 trust evaporates instantly under the specific language your grandmother used, and your claim to the entirety of the diverted funds becomes an absolute certainty." I felt a cold, refreshing clarity wash over me as I realized that the $189 DNA kit Harrison had used to insult me was actually the final piece of the puzzle I needed to dismantle his life's work. He had handed me the scalpel, and I was now standing over the body of his lies, ready to begin the final incision. The contrast between my life and the one I was about to reclaim was staggering. While Harrison was busy nursing his Macallan 18 and Brandon was charging $1,200 tabs to a company that was legally built on my stolen future, I was documenting the exact moment they had decided my worth was zero. The 12 archived property deeds told a story of greed that was almost pathetic in its transparency. A vacation home in Maine sold, and the proceeds vanished into one of Harrison's failed engineering ventures, a trust fund for my education that had been liquidated to pay off Brandon's private school debts after he was caught selling midterms. It was a systematic stripping of my identity and my security, carried out by the person who was supposed to be my protector. As I sat in Sterling's office on that 42nd floor, looking out at the city that Harrison thought he owned, I realized that power doesn't come from a title or a bank balance. It comes from having nothing left to lose and the truth on your side. I thought about my $25 Casio watch and how it had kept perfect time through every hour of this investigation. A silent witness to the fact that the truth doesn't need a luxury brand to be valid. The 142 pages of bank statements were more than just paper. They were the evidence of 31 years of a father's disdain and a mother's complicity. My mother, Diane, had stood by and watched as my grandmother's wishes were trampled, likely convinced by Harrison that it was for the good of the family, a word that in the Blackwood house was synonymous with his own comfort. I wondered if she had ever felt the weight of those stolen millions as she swirled her $85 Cabernet, or if she had simply allowed herself to become another custom fixture in Harrison's black BMW X7, beautiful to look at, but devoid of any real agency. The clarity I felt was not born of a desire for revenge, though revenge would certainly be a byproduct. It was born of a fundamental need for the universe to be righted, for the structural integrity of my own life to be restored. Marcus Sterling stood up and walked to the window, the smoke from his Davidoff cigar curling toward the ceiling in a silver ribbon. "We wait for the DNA results now," he said, his back to me. "Once that email hits your inbox, I want you to call me immediately. We won't be sending a polite letter, Evelyn. We'll be filing for an immediate freeze on all trust assets and a forensic audit of every Blackwood entity dating back to 1994. Your father thinks he's playing a game of pedigree, but we're going to show him that he's been living in a house of cards." I thanked him, the weight of the dossier in my hand feeling like a weapon, and I took the elevator down to the street level, re-entering the world of the living where people worked for their bread and fought for their lives. I didn't feel like the victim I had been 3 weeks ago. I felt like the architect of a new reality. The Blackwood Empire was about to find out that a senior trauma nurse knows exactly where the pressure points are. I drove my 2018 Honda Civic back to my small apartment, the engine humming a steady, reliable tune, and I walked up the stairs to my 640-square-foot sanctuary. I placed the yellow legal pad on the counter next to my coffee maker and stared at the vertical line I had drawn on the first night. Loyalty shown, 31 years. Respect received, 0%. The ledger was about to be balanced in a way Harrison Blackwood could never have engineered. I wasn't just a part of the bloodline, I was the only part of it that had any honor left, and I was going to use every page of those bank statements and every word of that 1994 will to make sure the truth was finally, irrevocably heard. The hiss of the radiator that night didn't sound like a warning, it sounded like an applause. I lay down and slept the sleep of the just, knowing that the 42nd floor and the Davidoff smoke were just the beginning of a storm that would wash the Blackwood name clean of its own filth. The audit was finished, the evidence was filed, and the DNA was in the mail. All that was left was the inevitable collapse of a $4.2 million lie. The trap was set with the kind of architectural precision my father usually reserved for his multi-million-dollar bridge designs, specifically timed for the annual Blackwood Gala on the evening of December 21st. Outside the sprawling estate, the Connecticut winter had descended with a jagged, unforgiving edge, the mercury dipping to a brutal 14 degrees, while a thin, crystalline layer of frost coated the long, winding driveway where a line of luxury vehicles sat like polished obsidian monuments. Inside the Great Hall, the atmosphere was a stifling contrast of artificial warmth and suffocating ego, illuminated by the cold, fractured light of a $12,000 Swarovski chandelier that hung from the vaulted ceiling like a frozen explosion. There were exactly 45 guests in attendance, a sea of black tie attire and floor-length silk gowns, representing the elite of the engineering and real estate world, all of them holding crystal flutes and speaking in the hushed, performative tones of the terminally wealthy. At the center of the room stood Harrison Blackwood, looking every bit the patriarch in a bespoke tuxedo that cost more than my first year of nursing school, his face flushed with the triumph of a man who believed he had successfully pruned the dead weight from his family tree. He was in the middle of a grand, sweeping toast to celebrate Brandon's recent promotion to senior vice president, a title that had been fabricated out of thin air to justify the golden child's continued drain on the company's resources. Harrison held a bottle of Krug champagne, the label shimmering under the Swarovski crystals, as he extolled the virtues of lineage and the importance of passing the torch to someone who shared the true Blackwood spirit. Brandon stood beside him, smirking, his hand resting casually on the lapel of his velvet dinner jacket, looking like a prince who had finally been promised the keys to a kingdom he hadn't lifted a finger to build. The air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the underlying metallic tang of cold ambition. I chose that exact moment to make my entrance, stepping through the heavy oak doors at precisely 9:15 p.m., the digital display on my $25 Casio watch clicking over as I crossed the threshold into the lion's den. I wasn't wearing the expected cocktail dress or the submissive expression of a daughter coming to beg for a second chance. Instead, I wore a tailored charcoal suit that fit like a suit of high-grade ballistic armor, its sharp lines cutting through the soft, decadent curves of the ballroom. I wasn't carrying a gift, nor was I carrying the burden of their expectations. Tucked under my arm was a thick, heavy manila folder, its weight a comforting presence against my side. Inside that folder lay the cumulative evidence of 3 weeks of forensic auditing, the 142 pages of stolen inheritance documentation, the DNA results that had arrived in my inbox like a lightning strike, and a freshly issued federal subpoena that Marcus Sterling had secured with the clinical efficiency of a professional executioner. As I walked across the polished marble floor, the rhythmic click of my heels sounded like a countdown. The guests began to turn, their conversations dying out in ripples of awkward silence as they recognized the black sheep daughter they had been told was no longer a part of the family narrative. I didn't stop until I was standing 10 feet from the head of the table, directly in the line of sight of the man who had spent 31 years trying to convince me I was a mistake. Harrison's smile didn't just fade, it curdled, turning into a mask of pure, unadulterated vitriol as he lowered his glass of Krug. "Evelyn," he said, his voice a low growl that barely carried over the soft hum of the climate control system, "you were not invited to this event. This is a celebration of the Blackwood legacy, a concept you clearly have no interest in representing. I suggest you leave before I have security escort you out into the cold where you belong." He looked at Brandon, seeking the silent reinforcement of his chosen heir, but I didn't give him the chance to continue the performance. I stepped forward, the charcoal fabric of my suit catching the light, and I placed the manila folder directly onto the white linen tablecloth, right next to the silver platter of hors d'oeuvres that cost $80 per serving. The sound of the folder hitting the table was heavy and final, a dull thud that seemed to echo louder than any of his empty toasts. "You're right about one thing, Harrison," I said, my voice projecting with the calm, authoritative clarity I used when directing a code blue in the trauma bay, where every word must be heard over the chaos of a dying patient. "This is about the Blackwood legacy, but it's not the one you've spent 30 years selling to these people." I reached into the folder and pulled out the first page, the DNA results, and I laid them flat on the table, turning them so he could see the bold, unmistakable percentages. "The DNA test you so graciously paid $189 for arrived 3 days ago. It confirms that I am your biological daughter, the only one in this room who can actually claim your bloodline. But more importantly, it confirms that the man standing next to you, the one you're handing 35% of a multi-million-dollar trust to, shares exactly 0% of your genetic markers. Brandon isn't a Blackwood, Harrison. He's a 30-year investment in a lie that my mother started and you were too arrogant to see." The silence that followed was so profound, I could hear the brutal 14-degree wind rattling the heavy glass panes of the conservatory. My mother, Diane, let out a sound that wasn't a cry but a wheeze, her face turning a shade of gray that matched the winter sky outside as she clutched her glass of $85 Cabernet so hard the stem snapped, splashing dark red liquid across her silk gown like a fresh wound. Brandon's smirk didn't just vanish, it collapsed into a look of sheer, panicked incomprehension, his eyes darting from the DNA report to the father who was now looking at him as if he were a structural defect in a failing bridge. But I wasn't finished. I pulled out the federal subpoena and the stack of bank statements from 1994, fanning them out across the table like a winning hand of cards. And since we're discussing legacies, I continued, my gaze locking onto Harrison's as he began to tremble with a mixture of rage and burgeoning terror, let's talk about the $4.2 million empire you built. Or rather, let's talk about the inheritance you stole from my grandmother's estate in 1994. My attorney, Marcus Sterling, and a forensic accountant have spent the last 3 weeks tracing every dollar you diverted from the trust Eleanor Blackwood left for me. This subpoena is for a federal audit of every Blackwood entity. Your properties in Greenwich, your custom BMW, even the champagne you're holding. It was all bought with money that legally belongs to me. You wanted to know if I was a part of this bloodline? Well, now you know. And as the sole biological heir to the Blackwood estate and the rightful owner of the diverted 1994 funds, I'm here to tell you that the restructuring you mentioned at Thanksgiving is finally happening. Only this time I'm the one signing the papers. The Swarovski chandelier above us seemed to hum with the tension of the moment, the cold light reflecting off the faces of 45 people who were witnessing the total demolition of a dynasty. Harrison tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing as he looked at the evidence of his fraud and the proof of his betrayal, but no sound came out. He looked like a man standing on the deck of a sinking ship, realizing for the first time that the lifeboats were all for show. I felt a sense of peace that was deeper than any I had known in my 31 years of life. I wasn't a senior trauma nurse in that moment. I was the architect of my own justice, the person who had finally repaired the structural integrity of her own life. I turned away from the table, leaving the folder and the wreckage of their lives behind, and walked back toward the door. The 14-degree air hit me as I stepped outside, but I didn't feel the cold. I felt light. I felt the weight of 31 years of being the mistake, the outlier, and the disappointment finally lifting from my shoulders and dissipating into the night. My 2018 Honda Civic was waiting for me at the end of the driveway, a humble, honest machine that I had earned with my own labor. As I drove away from the Blackwood estate, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the lights of the Swarovski chandelier flickering through the trees, a dying star in a sky that was finally starting to clear. Family isn't about the name on a trust or the percentage of DNA in a vial. It's about the integrity of the soul and the courage to stand in the truth when the world tries to bury you in lies. I was Evelyn Blackwood, and for the first time in my life, that name didn't belong to my father. It belonged to me. The empire had fallen, the audit was complete, and as the digital clock on my dashboard clicked over to 9:45 p.m., I realized that I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was finally, truly free. "Attention, everyone," I said, my voice cutting through the soft, syncopated rhythm of the live jazz trio like a surgical blade through gauze, instantly silencing the practiced laughter and the clinking of gold-rimmed crystal. I did not scream, nor did I allow the frantic energy of the room to dictate my tempo. Instead, I stood at the center of the $12,000 Swarovski chandelier's refracted light and simply started reading numbers with the cool, detached precision of a nurse reporting vitals during a trauma code. I reached into my charcoal suit jacket and pulled out a stack of high-quality stapled documents, 30 identical copies of the Ancestry DNA health results and the comprehensive forensic audit compiled by Marcus Sterling. With a steady hand, I began to distribute them to the front-row guests, the influential developers and city council members who had spent the last hour praising Harrison's legacy, watching as the papers moved like a contagion through the black-tie crowd. The room went silent, a heavy, airless vacuum where the only sound was the frantic rustle of paper and the distant, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. The results displayed on those pages were a total demolition of the Blackwood mythology, revealing in stark scientific percentages that I was the only biological child of Harrison Blackwood, possessing the precise genetic markers of the man who had spent 31 years treating me like a clerical error. But the true devastation lay in the profile for Brandon, the golden boy who was currently standing frozen with a glass of Krug champagne halfway to his lips. The DNA sequence proved beyond any legal or biological doubt that Brandon was the result of a clandestine affair my mother had conducted in the summer of 1995 with the family's then tennis coach, a man whose name had been whispered in hushed, scandalous tones for decades, but never confirmed until this 60-second spit test laid the truth bare. My mother, Diane, looked as though she were physically shrinking into her silk gown, her eyes fixed on the floor, as the 30 guests around her absorbed the reality of her 30-year deception. However, the biological revelation was merely the primary incision. The forensic audit was the part that would ensure the wound never closed. I continued to read from my master copy, my voice unwavering as I detailed the systematic embezzlement Harrison had orchestrated to maintain the facade of his empire. The audit proved with accounting certainty that my father had illegally diverted $1.2 million from the original 1994 trust my grandmother Eleanor had intended for my education and future security. He hadn't just ignored me, he had actively mined my inheritance like a private quarry to fund Brandon's $1,200 bottle service tabs, his $85,000 Porsche repairs, and the luxury lifestyle of a son who wasn't even his. Every time Harrison had looked at me with disdain for my 60-hour work weeks and my $92,000 salary, he had been doing so while standing on a platform built from the money he had stolen from me while I was still a child. I watched my father's face undergo a terrifying transformation, shifting from the arrogant, wine-flushed red of a victorious patriarch to a ghostly, translucent white that made his expensive tuxedo look like a shroud. The clinical data on the pages in front of the guests acted as a mirror, reflecting the rot at the heart of the Blackwood name. I pointed to the specific wire transfers, the forged signatures on the 1994 estate amendments, and the offshore accounts Harrison had used to wash the funds before depositing them into Brandon's allowance. The 45 guests, who had come for a gala, were now witnesses to a federal crime, their eyes darting between the documents and the man at the head of the table who was beginning to hyperventilate. Harrison's hand trembled so violently that his glass of Macallan 18 clattered against the mahogany, the amber liquid spilling across the forensic audit like a stain on a ledger that could never be balanced. He realized in that agonizing, silent minute that by sliding that $189 DNA kit across the table at Thanksgiving, he had effectively handed me the master key to his own prison cell. He had invited the audit. He had demanded the truth. And now the truth was standing in a charcoal suit, stripping him of his dignity, his fortune, and his legacy in front of everyone he had ever tried to impress. I didn't feel the heat of anger anymore. I felt the cold, refreshing clarity of a completed procedure. The Blackwood Empire was no longer a towering achievement of civil engineering. It was a structural failure that had reached its inevitable point of collapse. Brandon looked at my mother with a mixture of horror and betrayal, the velvet of his jacket looking cheap and gaudy in the harsh light of the truth, realizing that his entire existence as the heir apparent was a fiction authored by a woman's secret and sustained by a man's greed. Harrison tried to stand, his mouth working silently as he searched for a lie large enough to cover the 142 pages of evidence. But there were no words left in his vocabulary that could fix a $1.2 million deficit or a 0% genetic match. He was a man who lived by the code of structural integrity, and I had just proven that his own foundation was built on shifting sand and stolen bricks. The jazz trio had long since stopped playing, their instruments resting in a confused silence that matched the expressions of the socialites holding my DNA reports. I looked at the $12,000 Swarovski chandelier and thought about how many of my grandmother's dollars had been melted down to create that sparkle, how many of my missed birthdays and lonely night shifts had paid for the cognac leather in his BMW X7. Every detail of the room, the scent of the lilies, the temperature of the air, the shocked gasps of the aunts and cousins, was recorded in my mind with the same precision I used when documenting a patient's final moments. This was the final moment of the Blackwood family, as the world knew it. I stood my ground, my $25 Casio watch marking the seconds of their downfall, feeling the marrow-deep satisfaction of a debt finally called in. Harrison had wanted to know if I was a part of his bloodline, and I had shown him that not only was I his only true heir, but I was also the only one with the courage to perform the autopsy on his lies. I watched as the federal subpoena I had placed on the table seemed to grow in significance, the legal seal a promise of the investigations and asset freezes that would begin the moment the sun rose on December 22nd. My father's empire, valued at $4.2 million, was now a liability, a crime scene that would be picked over by Marcus Sterling and the authorities until every stolen cent was accounted for and returned to its rightful owner. The guests began to filter out, their movements hurried and awkward, leaving their half-finished glasses of Krug and their copies of my DNA results scattered across the tables like debris after a storm. None of them looked at Harrison as they left. They looked at me with a new, terrified respect, the kind of look people give to the survivor of a catastrophic event. I remained standing at the head of the room, the center of the silence, watching the man who called me a mistake realize that his only mistake was believing I was as weak as he was. The 14-degree wind was still howling outside, but inside the great hall, the air had turned frigid with the realization of total loss. My mother was still weeping silently, the dark red wine on her dress looking like an admission of guilt that no amount of bleach could ever remove. Brandon had slumped into a chair, his golden boy persona discarded like a broken toy, his future evaporating with every page of the audit that the guests had carried out into the night. I reached out and picked up the master copy of the report, tucking it back into the manila folder with a sense of finality. The procedure was over. The tumor had been removed. The Blackwood name was a hollow shell, and I was the only one who was walking away from the wreckage with my head held high. I looked at Harrison one last time, seeing not the powerful engineer who had ruled my life, but a small, frightened man who had traded his soul for a title and lost both. I turned toward the heavy oak doors, my tailored suit feeling like the only thing in the room that wasn't a lie, and walked out into the cold Connecticut night, leaving the echoes of the numbers I had read to haunt the empty ballroom. The ledger was balanced, the truth was filed, and Evelyn Blackwood was finally, legally and biologically, the only one left standing. The aftermath of that night at the Blackwood Gala was not a gradual fading of tension, but a violent, unstoppable landslide that buried 30 years of carefully constructed lies under the weight of federal law and biological truth. Within 48 hours of my departure from the estate, the Blackwood name, once a gilded hallmark of architectural prestige and social standing, became synonymous with a sprawling federal fraud investigation that dominated the local headlines and sent shockwaves through the very country clubs where my father once held court. Marcus Sterling moved with the predatory grace of a shark in shallow water, filing for an immediate emergency injunction that froze every trust asset, every corporate account, and even the title to the black 2024 BMW X7 that Harrison loved more than his own daughter. The structural integrity of his life did not just fail. It underwent a total, catastrophic collapse that no amount of engineering could ever hope to repair. As the forensic accountants began their deep dive into the 1994 will and the subsequent 3 decades of systematic embezzlement, the man who had once sneered at my $92,000 salary found himself unable to even pay the retainer for a defense attorney without a court-appointed monitor scrutinizing every cent. Today, the landscape of the Blackwood family has been reshaped by the cold hand of justice and the unyielding reality of their own choices. Harrison Blackwood is currently facing a prison sentence of 5 to 10 years for a litany of charges including fiduciary breach, wire fraud, and grand larceny. His expensive tuxedo replaced by a standard-issue jumpsuit that doesn't care about his pedigree or his $4.2 million portfolio. I watched him during the preliminary hearing, his skin looking like gray parchment and his hands trembling without a glass of Macallan 18 to steady them, and I felt nothing but a quiet, clinical sense of closure. He had spent his entire life building a monument to himself using bricks he had stolen from me, and now he was finally beginning to understand the true cost of a foundation built on air. Brandon, the golden child who had never known the weight of a hard day's work, suffered perhaps the most jarring transition of all. Without the corporate American Express card or the $85,000 Porsche repairs to shield him from his own incompetence, he was evicted from his luxury condo and forced to trade his $450 Theory blazers for a polyester uniform. He is currently living in a 300-square-foot studio apartment in a neighborhood he used to mock, earning $16 an hour at a regional warehouse where he moves boxes instead of shifting imaginary assets. My mother, Diane, is living in a small, quiet townhouse paid for by the meager remnants of her own premarital savings, the 18-year-old secret of the tennis coach having finally stripped her of the custom cognac leather and the $12,000 chandeliers she traded her integrity to keep. She sends me letters occasionally, written on plain stationery instead of embossed cardstock, filled with apologies that feel as thin and hollow as the life she led for 30 years. I haven't opened the last 3. In the trauma ward, we know that some wounds are too deep to be stitched, and some infections require the total removal of the affected tissue to save the patient. My family was a necrotic limb, and the amputation, though painful, was the only way I could survive. I have moved on from the 640-square-foot apartment where the radiator hissed at 4:15 a.m., not because I hated the struggle, but because I finally reclaimed the resources that were legally and morally mine from the beginning. I am now living in a quiet, sun-drenched house located in a neighborhood where the trees are old and the air smells of pine and honest earth instead of Davidoff cigars and desperation. I bought it outright with a portion of the recovered $1.2 million that Harrison had embezzled, a transaction that felt like the final satisfying click of a bone being set back into its proper place. The house features a solid oak front door that I painted a deep, welcoming navy blue, and behind it lies a life that is entirely of my own making. My bank account is no longer a source of anxiety or a metric of my father's disdain. It is a tool for a future where I don't have to pick up double shifts just to pay for a $25 Casio watch. I still work as a senior trauma nurse, but I do so because I love the raw honesty of the work, the way it reminds me every single day that life is fragile and the truth is the only thing that remains when everything else is stripped away. I still wear a digital watch because it reminds me that time is the most valuable currency we have, and I refuse to waste another second of mine trying to prove I belong at a table that was never built for me. The silence of my new home is a different kind of quiet than the one I grew up with. It isn't the suffocating silence of secrets and suppressed rage, but the peaceful stillness of a woman who has finally found her own rhythm. I have a garden now, where I spend my Sunday mornings digging in the dirt, feeling the sun on my neck and the strength in my hands, the same hands that saved lives during the night shift and dismantled a criminal empire during the day. Sometimes, when the light hits the floorboards at a certain angle, I think back to that Thanksgiving dinner and the blue and white DNA kit sliding across the mahogany table. I realize now that Harrison didn't hand me a test. He handed me a mirror, and for the first time in his life, he was forced to see exactly what he had created. He wanted to prove I wasn't a Blackwood, and in doing so, he proved that I was the only person in that house who truly understood the meaning of the name. I was the only one with the structural integrity to stand up to the truth. The properties in Greenwich were sold to settle the legal claims, and the $4.2 million empire was dismantled and redistributed to the people Harrison had cheated over the decades, leaving him with nothing but the 4 walls of a cell and the memory of a daughter who was too smart to be broken. Brandon's $16 an hour warehouse job is the first honest thing he has ever done, and perhaps, in the long run, it will do more for his character than a vice presidency ever could have. But I am no longer responsible for their growth or their redemption. I have spent 31 years carrying the weight of their expectations, and I have finally set that burden down on the other side of my new front door. My life is no longer a transaction where I am always in debt. It is a balance sheet where the loyalty shown and the respect received are finally in perfect alignment. I often think about the moral of this long, jagged journey, the realization that family is not something that is dictated by a laboratory result or a line in a will. Family is the group of people who see your worth without requiring a forensic audit to prove it. It is the people who stay when the champagne runs out and the Swarovski chandelier goes dark. I have found that family in my colleagues at the hospital, in the neighbors who brought me sourdough bread when I moved in, and in the quiet reflection I see in the mirror every morning. I am Evelyn Blackwood, a name that no longer carries the scent of Macallan 18 or the weight of a stolen legacy. It is a name that represents resilience, independence, and the surgical precision required to cut out the toxic parts of one's life to ensure the rest of the body can thrive. As I sit on my porch and watch the sunset over the Connecticut hills, the brutal 14-degree winter long since replaced by the warmth of a new season, I feel a sense of belonging that has nothing to do with bloodlines. I belong to myself. I belong to the truth. And I belong to a future that is no longer being financed by a bitter man's lies. The landslide is over, the dust has settled, and the ground beneath my feet is finally, irrevocably solid. I have learned that you cannot fix a structural failure by painting over the cracks. You have to be willing to tear the whole thing down and start over with honest materials. I am the architect of my own peace, the foreman of my own destiny, and for the first time in my 31 years, I am exactly where I am supposed to be. The Blackwood lie has been archived, the case is closed, and the only numbers that matter now are the ones that tell the story of my own quiet, hard-earned happiness. My life is my own, and that is an inheritance that no one can ever take away.